In 1977, a young policeman from a small California coastal town disappeared without a trace while on routine night patrol. Everyone assumed he had simply abandoned duty and gone into hiding until 13 years later, a fisherman discovered something shocking at the base of a remote cliff. His rusty patrol car emerged from the waves with evidence inside, revealing a horrifying truth about that night. This is his story. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe if you believe forgotten stories deserve to be told. The fog was thick tonight, a cold, damp blanket swallowing the narrow coastal highway whole. Thomas Clark, 26 and barely 2 years on the force, gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn plastic. The patrol car, a sturdy but aging Ford, felt like a solitary vessel navigating a milky sea. Each mile felt heavier than the last, the familiar curves of Highway 1 disappearing into the opaque void ahead, illuminated only by the weak beams of his headlights. This stretch of road, clinging precariously to the cliffside, was notorious, beautiful by day, treacherous and isolating by night. Thomas knew it well. He'd grown up just a few miles inland, and the roar of the unseen ocean below felt like the heartbeat of his community. He'd taken this job with a fervent idealism, dreaming of protecting the quiet rhythm of this place, of being the steady hand his neighbors could rely on. He saw himself rising through the ranks, becoming a figure of trust and respect, maybe even settling down and raising a family in this very town he swore to serve. Tonight, however, a subtle unease pricked at him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. The fog wasn't just outside. It felt like it was pressing in, muffling the usual comforting sounds of the car engine and the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn. It was a routine patrol, the same one he'd done dozens of times, checking for speeders, ensuring lonely farmhouses were secure. But the silence felt deeper tonight, the isolation more profound. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, the crisp collar of his uniform feeling suddenly tight. He thought of Sarah, waiting for him back at their small apartment, their plans for the weekend, a simple barbecue, a walk on the beach he might never see again. The road ahead remained a featureless gray wall, and somewhere within its depths, the night held its breath. The salt spray kissed the patrol car's windshield in phantom streaks, quickly lost to the growing, opaque wall of fog rolling in from the Pacific. Officer Clark gripped the steering wheel, knuckles just a little whiter than usual, the worn leather cool beneath his palms. It was late, past the hour when even the hardy few who lived along this isolated coastal stretch were asleep. The road ahead was a narrow, winding ribbon disappearing into the swirling white. Duty kept him moving, the routine patrol necessary, a line drawn against the encroaching darkness and emptiness. His thoughts drifted to the porch light. He knew his wife would leave on, the quiet warmth of their small house, the promise of coffee and the morning paper. Just a few more miles, he told himself. Just finish the sector. The silence outside was profound, broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the occasional click of pebbles under the tires. The fog had thickened dramatically in the last half hour, reducing visibility to mere yards. Headlights became diffuse, useless halos in the impenetrable white. He felt an odd prickle on the back of his neck, not fear, but a deep, ancient unease that came with being utterly alone against something vast and unseen. He scanned the dark shapes of the cypress trees lining the cliff edge, their forms distorted, monstrous in the mist. There was nothing out here but the sea and the fog, yet the feeling persisted, a sense of being watched, of the world holding its breath. A sudden, sharp crack echoed faintly from the cliffs above, distinct from the ocean's murmur, cutting through the silence. He slowed the car, listening, the sound hanging in the dense cold air before fading, leaving only the oppressive weight of the fog and a quickening beat in his chest. The road twisted sharply ahead, the white wall closing in. The cool, heavy mist had rolled in fast, swallowing the familiar road signs and blurring the pale ribbon of asphalt ahead of Officer Clark's headlights. One moment, the engine hummed a steady rhythm against the quiet night, the scent of salt and damp earth filling the air. The next, a profound sense of isolation descended, thicker than the fog itself. He remembered glancing at the clock on the dash, just minutes until his mandatory check-in. A simple, habitual task performed countless times. He thought briefly of home, the warmth waiting there, a pang of simple longing. Then, silence. Not just the absence of sound outside, but a deeper internal quiet, a sudden, jarring disconnect that severed the thread of the ordinary evening. At the station, the dispatcher's voice crackled. "Adam 4, check in. Adam 4, are you there?" Silence answered her. The scheduled check-in time passed. She tried again, a hint of impatience coloring her tone, then concern. The static on the line felt heavier, a mocking presence. Over the next few minutes, the routine calls escalated into something else entirely. The desk sergeant, a man who rarely showed emotion, stood over the console, his face tight. The dispatcher's fingers trembled as she hit the transmit button repeatedly, her voice now tight with rising panic. "Adam 4, respond immediately. Officer Clark, do you copy?" Still nothing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, filling the small office space. The dread began subtly, a cold seep, then spread like wildfire through the few officers gathered, finishing paperwork or sipping lukewarm coffee. They looked at each other, eyes wide, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Where was he? A simple patrol run, a quiet night, had just cracked open, revealing an abyss beneath. The reality hammered down. He hadn't just missed a check-in. Officer Clark had simply vanished, swallowed by the mist and the night, leaving behind only a deafening silence and the growing, sickening certainty that this was no false alarm. The next hours would bring the chilling mobilization, the desperate calls, and the first desperate search into the unforgiving coastline. The first hours were a blur of desperate action and mounting fear. Police officers, joined quickly by firemen and local volunteers who knew the rugged coastline, fanned out from the station, heading towards the general area where her patrol car was last reported. This was 1977. There were no satellites to pinpoint a location, no thermal drones to sweep the terrain, just tired eyes scanning the ground and crackling radios that often dropped signal in the steep ravines. They carried flashlights that cast weak beams against the gathering twilight, maps wrinkled with saltwater spray, and a sinking feeling that grew heavier with every fruitless step. Back at the small station, her parents sat on hard plastic chairs, clutching worn handkerchiefs, every passing minute amplifying the silence of the empty room and the terrifying unknown unfolding outside. Each phone call that came in brought a spike of panicked hope, only to be dashed by the somber tone of the voice on the other end. The search area itself was a cruel adversary. Towering cliffs, slick with sea spray, plunged hundreds of feet into the crashing surf below. The ground inland was a tangle of thorny scrub and loose scree, treacherous underfoot. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a thick, damp fog began to roll in from the sea, a silent, suffocating blanket that swallowed visibility within minutes. It clung to the air, chilling skin and spirits alike. making the already difficult task of searching the jagged rocks and hidden inlets nearly impossible. Hands that had gripped steering wheels or fishing nets now scraped against rock faces, feeling for any sign, any misplaced item, anything at all. The rhythmic roar of the waves against the cliffs was the only constant sound, a powerful, indifferent backdrop to the frantic shouts of searchers calling her name, their voices quickly absorbed by the mist. Hope, initially a bright flicker, began to shrink, a fragile flame buffeted by the cold reality of the challenging environment and the stubborn absence of any trace. As the fog deepened, swallowing landmarks and blurring the line between land and sea, the order came down the radio: suspend the active ground search until dawn. The decision hung heavy in the air, a tacit admission that darkness and fog had won the first round, leaving behind only the churning uncertainty and a coastline now shrouded in impenetrable mystery, waiting silently to give up its secrets or hold them forever. Weeks bled into months. The initial flurry of activity, sirens wailing, officers fanning out, the station buzzing with frantic calls, began to subside like a tide retreating from the shore. The faces of the searchers grew weary, the hopeful urgency replaced by grim routine. Patrol cars that had idled outside the Clark house for days were seen less often, their comforting presence slowly fading. The posters plastered on every lamppost and storefront, bearing Officer Sarah Clark's kind, smiling face, started to peel at the edges, their bright ink fading under the relentless California sun. The official investigation, extensive at first, found no purchase, no solid lead to cling to. Witness accounts yielded nothing but confused recollections of a quiet night. The initial suspects were cleared. The trails grew cold, then froze over entirely. Detectives called less frequently, their voices tinged with a weary finality that David Clark, Sarah's husband, came to dread more than anything. He would listen, his grip tightening on the receiver, the sound of his own breathing loud in the hollow silence of the house, understanding without being told that the structured official search was winding down. The profound impact settled over the Clark household like a heavy fog. David moved through his days in a haze of disbelief and crushing grief. Each sunrise felt like a cruel joke, another day without Sarah. The children, young Michael and little Emily, stopped asking, "When is Mommy coming home?" in hopeful voices, and started asking it in quiet, fearful whispers, or sometimes not at all. Michael, usually boisterous, became withdrawn, his small hands twisting nervously at the dinner table where Sarah's chair remained conspicuously empty. Emily, the youngest, would sometimes stand by the front door, clutching her worn teddy bear, simply waiting, her wide eyes fixed on the street, as if expecting Sarah's familiar patrol car to round the corner any moment. The mystery deepened, becoming a suffocating weight. Where had she gone? What had happened? The unanswered questions echoed in every room, clung to every object she had touched. David would find himself staring at her neatly folded uniform shirt in the closet, still faintly smelling of her, a painful relic of a life abruptly halted. The polished leather of her duty belt lay on her dresser, inert and silent, a symbol of her work, yet offering no clues to her fate. Hope, once a fiercely guarded flame, dwindled to a flickering ember, threatened by the cold reality of time passing and official inaction. The enduring pain wasn't a wave that crashed and receded. It was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their lives, a pervasive uncertainty that gnawed at their sense of peace. They were left adrift, isolated in their grief, the official world moving on while their world remained shattered, fixed on the night she vanished, wondering if they could ever find answers the police couldn't. 13 years stretched out like an endless gray horizon, each day a quiet ache for the family left behind. The small coastal town, once buzzing with search efforts and whispered theories, slowly settled back into its rhythm. But beneath the surface, the wound festered. They learned to live around the emptiness, the vacant chair at the dinner table, the unused bedroom frozen in time, collecting dust like a forgotten memory. The mother, Sarah, would often find herself just standing in the doorway, tracing the outline of faded posters on the wall, breathing in the faint, lingering scent of her daughter's perfume, a private ritual that tightened a knot of grief in her chest, a sharp, silent agony that no amount of crying could release. The father, Thomas, retreated into himself, finding solace in the ceaseless, pounding rhythm of the waves down by the pier, their unchanging sound, a stark contrast to the seismic shift that had fractured his life. Anniversaries were the cruelest reminders, marked not with celebration, but with a heavy silence. The air thick with unspoken questions. Hope, once a fierce burning ember, dwindled over the years, sometimes flickering back to life with a misguided phone call or a stranger's passing resemblance, only to die down again, leaving behind a colder, heavier ash. Intrusive thoughts became unwelcome companions, imagining the worst, picturing scenarios born of fear and uncertainty. A mental torture that offered no respite. The community tried to help, offering casseroles and kind words, but their own lives moved on, leaving the family stranded in a perpetual state of limbo, unable to grieve fully, unable to move forward, bound by the lack of closure. It was the not knowing, the endless unanswered questions, that was the true torment, a constant hum of despair just below the surface of everyday life. This prolonged, agonizing silence was a prison, the bars forged from the unknown fate of their beloved daughter, trapping them in a loop of sorrow and fading hope, a cycle that felt destined to repeat forever, until the unforgiving sea itself finally decided to give up one of its secrets. 13 years was a long time to carry a single freezing moment. For Daniel, it felt like a lifetime lived under a gray, suffocating blanket woven from fear and shame. That night, a 17-year-old kid, on his way back from a late shift at the diner, he saw the headlights behind him, closer than they should have been, on that winding, empty coastal road. He wasn't speeding, not really, but the sudden pressure made him grip the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. Just as Officer Clark's patrol car rounded the blind curve, Daniel's old pickup hit a patch of loose gravel. The rear end fishtailed hard, sending a spray of stones towards the oncoming vehicle. He corrected instinctively, swerving slightly into the officer's lane before jerking back, his heart leaping into his throat. In his rearview mirror, he saw the patrol car swerve violently in response, its tires screaming a desperate protest against the asphalt before dipping off the shoulder. Then silence, a heavy, immediate silence that swallowed the sound of the ocean and his own ragged breathing. Panic clawed up his throat. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He mashed the accelerator, the old truck groaning, leaving the scene, the dark void where the police car had been, burning into his mind. For over a decade, every siren sent a jolt of icy dread through him. Every conversation about Officer Clark's disappearance felt like a tightening noose. He built a quiet life, married, had a daughter, but the weight never lessened. It sat on his chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe sometimes. The image of those headlights and the final, terrifying silence, a constant, unwelcome guest. The news about the car being found had ripped the fragile scab off the old wound, making the secret feel heavier, sharper, impossible to contain any longer. The ocean air, usually a comfort, now tasted of salt and rust, a constant reminder of what lay beneath the waves and what he had left behind that night. He found himself staring at the local newspaper, the headline about the recovered vehicle blurring through unshed tears, the silent scream he'd held inside for 13 years finally threatening to break free. The past was no longer just a memory. It was rising to meet him. 13 years had settled over the coast like the perpetual shroud of fog that defined it. 13 years of the ocean swallowing secrets and the mist holding them captive. But then, something shifted. It began subtly, a nagging persistence in the wind, blowing from an unaccustomed quarter, carrying the scent of brine not heavy and damp, but sharp and clean. Day after day, for the first time in memory, the dense, suffocating fog that usually clung to the cliffs like wet wool began to thin. It didn't lift all at once, but pulled back grudgingly, revealing patches of choppy gray water, then jagged teeth of rock near the shore. A deep pressure system, stalled and defiant, seemed to hold the marine layer at bay, pushing it miles out to sea. The air turned crisp, carrying the distant cries of gulls with startling clarity. Old Man Hemlock, his face weathered into a road map of the coast he knew intimately, stood on the bluff, his worn cap pulled low, squinting. He had fished these waters for 60 years, navigated them blind by sound and instinct when the fog was thickest. But there was one stretch, just south of the old lighthouse ruins, that remained a perpetual mystery, a place swallowed whole by the mist and the angry currents. It was a jagged wound in the coastline, notoriously dangerous, whispered about, but rarely seen clearly. Now, as the sun, a pale disk previously invisible, began to break through, a section of that forbidden coastline became visible. The fog peeled away from the cliff face there, exposing sheer drops, unseen caves where the sea foamed like a rabid mouth, and a narrow, treacherous shelf of rock previously hidden under swirling veils. A strange, unsettling silence fell over the water in that specific spot, the usual roar of waves muted, as if the ocean itself held its breath. Hemlock felt a cold prickle on his skin, a mix of awe and foreboding. He saw the raw power of the place, the way the water clawed at the stone, and a deep, heavy feeling settled in his gut. The coast held its secrets tight, but nature, in this rare, stark moment of clarity, had just ripped open a window, revealing a truth that had remained submerged for over a decade, waiting in the unforgiving elements. Something was out there, in the newly exposed light, something the fog had protected, and Hemlock knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the sudden breeze off the water, that he had to see what it was. The wind was a constant, biting companion on the exposed clifftop, whipping Sarah's hair across her face as she paused, catching her breath. Below, the Pacific stretched out, an endless expanse of shifting blues and greens, the waves pounding relentlessly against the sheer rock face hundreds of feet down. This stretch of trail was less traveled, more rugged, offering solitude away from the main paths. She leaned against a weathered boulder, scanning the breathtaking, yet unforgiving, landscape. It was in that moment, letting her gaze wander idly down the precipitous drop, that something caught her eye. Far below, tucked into a narrow, almost invisible ledge, was a flicker of unnatural light, a metallic glint, tiny against the vast scale of the cliff, utterly out of place. Curiosity pricked at her. What could it be? Trash? Debris washed ashore and somehow snagged so high up? She squinted, trying to discern its shape against the rough texture of the rock. It wasn't just a random piece of shiny rock. It had a definite form, geometric, dull silver, catching the sunlight intermittently as the wind buffeted it slightly. Unease began to coil in her stomach. This wasn't a spot where hikers usually ventured off trail, nor was it accessible from the beach below. Its location felt deliberate, or perhaps the result of a catastrophic fall from above. The old stories, the whispers that still circulated in town about the vanished policewoman and her patrol car found years later at the base of a different cliff, flooded her mind. Could this remote, hidden spot, overlooking the very coast where tragedy had struck, hold another piece of that chilling puzzle? A sudden cold certainty settled over her. This wasn't just junk. This felt significant, heavy with unspoken history. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the howl of the wind. It was a moment suspended between the mundane beauty of the hike and the potential uncovering of a long-buried secret. She had to tell someone. Fumbling with trembling fingers, she pulled out her phone, the signal surprisingly strong here, and dialed the number she knew by heart, the local sheriff's office. The small, glinting object far below held a terrible, silent promise, waiting for the world to look closer. The retrieval operation was a slow, brutal ballet against the sheer cliff face and the relentless pull of the tide. Ropes strained, winches groaned, and the sea spray whipped against the faces of the recovery team, stinging their eyes and coating their gear in salt. Officer Miller watched from a precarious ledge, the salt taste sharp on his lips, his stomach tight with a sickening mix of dread and morbid curiosity. Getting down to the narrow strip of beach at the base had required navigating a treacherous goat trail, ropes fixed to sheer rock faces, a logistical nightmare for securing the site and bringing down the necessary equipment. As the rusted hulk was slowly winched higher, inch by agonizing inch, its details began to emerge from the barnacle-crusted chaos. It was unmistakably a sedan, its original color long gone under a thick layer of marine growth and iron oxide. Miller's breath hitched as he saw the twisted remnants of what looked like a light bar bolted to the roof. It couldn't be, a voice whispered in his head, battling against the growing certainty that settled like a lead weight in his gut. They secured the car on a relatively flat section of rock, the sound of the waves a mournful accompaniment to their work. Careful hands, gloved and deliberate, began to clear away debris. Through a shattered window, the outline of a police radio could be seen. Then, a forensic technician carefully scraped away rust near the rear license plate mount. Numbers appeared, faded, but readable. Miller felt his heart hammer against his ribs, the sound echoing louder than the crashing waves. Another sweep, a different area, and a small, distinct departmental logo emerged beneath layers of grime and time. The air grew still among the small group. A hush fell over the beach, broken only by the persistent shush of the water. Then came the VIN check, run through the database. When the confirmation crackled back over the radio, a specific make, model, and year registered to the city police department, assigned to car number 32, Officer Miller closed his eyes for a brief moment, a profound sadness washing over him. Car 32, Officer Clark's car. The rusted wreck was it. The relief that she hadn't simply vanished, that there was something here, was instantly crushed by the grim reality of the battered metal shell. Across the beach, he saw Detective Harding slump against a rock, his face pale, the weight of the community's long-held assumptions about a simple disappearance dissolving into this undeniable tragic proof. The silence spoke volumes, a collective intake of breath before the next necessary steps could begin. What secrets did the ravaged interior hold? The afternoon sun slanted through the living room window, casting long, dust-filled beams across worn furniture that had hosted 1,000 uncertain waiting hours over 13 years. The quiet hum of a distant lawnmower was the only sound until the sharp, decisive ring of the doorbell sliced through the air. Officer Clark's mother rose slowly from her chair, her joints protesting, a familiar knot tightening in her stomach, the same knot that had lived there since the first night her daughter didn't come home. Her husband followed, his face a mask of weary resignation. 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, their expressions solemn, eyes avoiding direct contact. It wasn't the hopeful knock they had clung to for so long. This felt heavy, final. The words that followed hung in the air, devastatingly simple, yet carrying the weight of a lifetime of unanswered questions. The patrol car found. Evidence confirmed. Sarah. The name, spoken with quiet reverence, landed like a physical blow. A strangled cry escaped the mother's lips. The father's shoulders slumped as if the air had been sucked from the room. Grief, raw and overwhelming, washed over them, a tsunami of sorrow for the daughter lost, the future stolen, the vibrant life extinguished so long ago. This was the ending they had dreaded, yet somewhere beneath the crushing pain, a strange, almost shameful wave of relief rippled through the void the uncertainty had created. 13 years of imagining scenarios, of clinging to impossible hopes, of the constant gnawing question mark. It was gone. The agony of not knowing had finally ceased, replaced by the finite, terrible pain of truth. They looked at each other through a haze of tears, the shared understanding passing between them. The worst had happened, but at last, the waiting was over. The house felt different now, heavier with sorrow, yet strangely lighter without the suffocating cloak of suspense. The path ahead, though steeped in mourning, now had a dreadful clarity, forcing them to confront the logistics that followed such a devastating confirmation. The biting wind whipped strands of salt-laced hair across his face as Detective Miller crouched beside the twisted hulk of the patrol car, its rusted metal screaming silently under a decade of ocean's unforgiving caress. Barnacles clung like grim ornaments to what remained of the chassis, and thick kelp draped across the hood, obscuring the shattered remains of the windshield. This wasn't a clean scene. It was a grave, exposed to the relentless elements for 13 long years, every detail a battle against decay. His gloved fingers traced the ragged edge of a tear in the metal near the driver's side door, a primary impact point, cold and sharp, even through the material. He imagined the force required, the violent instant the steel crumpled. The team worked meticulously around him, flashlights cutting through the gloom of the late afternoon, documenting the debris field scattered across the rocky base of the cliff face. Up above, other officers mapped the narrow, winding road where the car had left its path. Was it speed? A sudden swerve? The road itself was slick here, dangerously close to the sheer drop. Every scratch, every dent on the vehicle, every loose piece of gravel on the embankment above was a potential clue, a whisper from the past they were desperate to hear. Miller knelt lower, peering into the murky interior, the stench of stagnant water, oil, and something deeper, more organic, filling his lungs. He saw a faded map tucked into the door pocket, a child's drawing maybe, stuck to the dash with hardened tape, ghosts of a life cut short, mundane details made profoundly tragic by their resting place. A knot tightened in his chest, the sheer difficulty of finding truth buried under rust and time. felt insurmountable. Yet the thought of the missing officer, the questions that had haunted this town for years, spurred him on. His hand brushed against something metallic lodged beneath the driver's seat. It wasn't part of the car. Carefully, fighting against the resistance of sediment and corrosion, he worked it free. It was small, metallic, intricately shaped. As he wiped it clean on his sleeve, a symbol emerged, recognizable, but out of place in a police car. A detail that snagged at his understanding of that night. It was a locket, tarnished but intact, bearing an emblem he didn't expect to see here. A clue that pulled the focus away from the simple mechanics of a crash and hinted at something far more deliberate, far more sinister, something requiring them to look beyond the wreck itself. The chill from the television screen seemed to seep into the air around them, colder than the coastal fog that often hugged the town. The news anchor's voice, usually a distant drone, cut through the quiet evening, sharp and inescapable. They heard the words patrol car, missing officer, discovered, and a tremor started deep in their gut, a cold, heavy stone finally beginning to shift after 13 long years. It wasn't just the discovery of the wreck that struck like a physical blow. It was the horrifying certainty that any evidence inside, any lingering echo of that night, would point towards a truth buried under years of silence. A wave of nausea washed over them, the room tilting slightly, the familiar furniture suddenly looking alien and accusing. For years, the secret had been a lead cloak draped over their shoulders, a suffocating weight that pressed down on every breath, every thought. Sleep offered little escape, only a restless dance with shadows and the phantom sound of crashing waves and silenced cries. Each passing year added another layer to the burden, the fear of exposure, a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their life. They had built walls, perfected masks, buried the memory so deep it felt sometimes like a story read in a book, not a moment lived in terrifying reality. But the news report wasn't a story. It was the past erupting into the present, tearing open the meticulously constructed facade. Panic flared, hot and sudden, a desperate urge to run, to disappear, to bury themselves deeper still. But beneath the panic, a different feeling stirred. Tentative at first, then growing with surprising strength, a strange, agonizing relief. The choice had been taken away. The truth, long a captive, was about to break free on its own, dragging them with it. The years of hiding had been a slow internal decay. Now, facing the inevitable, the sheer exhaustion of carrying the secret finally overwhelmed the terror. The guilt, a festering wound kept hidden, pulsed with renewed intensity, demanding attention, demanding release. A profound ache settled in their chest, a yearning for air, for light, for the chance, however slim, to lessen the crushing weight, to offer some form of atonement. Their hands, slick with sweat, trembled as they reached towards the phone. The dial tone, a harsh, resonant sound in the sudden silence of the room. The first fragile step taken into the glaring light of day. The air in the small gray interrogation room felt heavy and stale, thick with unspoken fear and decades of loss. Officer Clark's parents sat side by side, hands clasped tightly in their laps, faces etched with 13 years of unanswered questions. An older brother stood stiffly behind them, jaw clenched. Across the table sat the witness, eyes downcast, their voice a low, strained monotone as they finally began to piece together the fractured reality of that long-ago night. They spoke of the unexpected stop on the remote coastal road, the blinding headlights, the sudden, heart-stopping moment the young officer saw something she shouldn't have. It wasn't malice, the witness explained, recounting the frantic seconds, but a cascade of terrible mistakes born of panic. The witness described the officer's quick, decisive action, a flash of training kicking in, followed by a desperate, ill-conceived attempt to evade immediate danger. She was just trying to get away, the witness seemed to plead silently through their narrative, recounting the swerve, the loss of control on the slick gravel shoulder, the sickening crunch of metal as the car plunged over the edge. A single wrong turn, a split-second misjudgment. The family listened, breath held tight in their chests. A choked sob escaped the mother's lips, a sound like tearing fabric, as the witness described the horrifying, irreversible momentum of the vehicle tumbling into the blackness below. It wasn't a grand conspiracy, wasn't a planned ambush, but a gut-wrenching series of unfortunate circumstances. A simple patrol gone catastrophically wrong in the blink of an eye. Tears streamed silently down the father's face, hitting the sterile tabletop with quiet splatters. The stark simplicity of the truth was more brutal than any fabricated villainy. There was no evil mastermind to hate, only a confluence of fear, bad timing, and human error that stole their daughter. The brother sagged against the wall, his rigidity crumbling. The witness finished speaking, the room falling into a deafening silence, broken only by ragged breathing and the low hum of the fluorescent lights. The weight of the revealed truth settled upon them all, a crushing, undeniable burden that brought painful clarity to years of agonizing speculation. The officer's final moments, simple and tragic, hung in the air, demanding witness to the devastating aftermath that stretched forward into the investigation's next phase. The court's final judgment echoed the undeniable truth unearthed from the rusty metal, a truth that settled over the small town like a persistent fog. Accountability, a word long sought, finally found its place, binding the individual responsible to a future woven with mandatory community service and a public acknowledgement of the life they had stolen. A consequence designed to force reflection rather than simply remove them from sight. For the family, the verdict offered a complicated form of relief, not erasing the ache, but clearing the path forward. They could finally reclaim her from the cold, dark water and give her the dignity she deserved in death. Under a sky the color of bruised plums, they gathered at the small, wind-swept cemetery overlooking the churning sea, the air thick with the scent of salt and damp earth. A small, polished wooden casket, holding what the ocean had reluctantly surrendered after 13 years, rested beside the open grave. Her mother, a woman etched with time and sorrow, reached out a trembling hand to touch the wood, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. The scrape of shovels filling the hole felt brutally final, each thud a hammer blow against the fragile hope they had clung to for over a decade. They watched in silence, the wind whipping at their clothes, carrying the distant cry of gulls that seemed to mourn alongside them. This was not a return to normal, but the painful, necessary act of integrating the horror into their lives, burying not just her remains, but the long, agonizing uncertainty that had haunted their every breath. As the last clod of earth settled, a quiet, exhausted peace began to stir within the depths of their grief, a fragile seed planted in freshly turned ground. The grave marker stood as a silent testament, a place to visit, to remember, and a stark reminder that even after the truth is found and the body laid to rest, the living must still find a way to carry on. The town breathed, slowly, for the first time in years. The heavy blanket of mystery that had stifled them, turning a bright young life into a whispered cautionary tale, finally lifted. With the truth of Officer Clark's fate laid bare, grief washed over the community, not with the sharp sting of sudden loss, but with the deep ache of a wound left unhealed for far too long. A quiet movement began, a collective need to right a wrong, to honor the sacrifice that had been so unjustly overshadowed by assumption. At the Town Hall Square, where the annual summer festival unfolded each year, a small granite memorial appeared. It was simple, etched with her name, her dates, and the shield of the police force. People came in a slow, steady stream, leaving wildflowers from their gardens, small, weathered stones from the beach, handwritten notes tucked beneath the edge of the plaque. The air around the memorial often smelled faintly of sea salt and blooming roses. A formal dedication service followed, not with grand speeches, but with quiet reflections. The mayor spoke of her dedication, the police chief of her bravery, and an old-school friend shared memories of her infectious laugh. Tears fell openly, not just for her lost life, but for the years they had unknowingly wronged her memory. The sound of the ocean seemed louder that day, a constant, rhythmic pulse beneath the hushed crowd. In the eyes of every person gathered, there was a shared burden lifted, replaced by a profound respect. Sarah Clark wasn't the officer who vanished. She was the one who stood her ground, who paid the ultimate price in the line of duty. Her short life, once viewed with suspicion, now shone as a beacon of courage, a reminder of the quiet heroes who walked among them. The memorial, catching the afternoon sun, seemed to gleam with a light that erased the past shadow. A sense of collective peace settled, a silent promise to remember her always, properly. But even as the town found its footing in remembrance, the raw edges of the trauma lingered, particularly for those closest to the truth unveiled. Years had passed since the ocean yielded its terrible secret, and the truth of that cold night finally surfaced. The initial shock had slowly settled, replaced by a profound, aching sorrow that was, paradoxically, a balm. The family, long suspended in a state of agonizing uncertainty, could at last begin to breathe, though the air in their home still seemed thick with the memory of their long wait. The quiet knowing, the factual confirmation of her fate and the identity of her killer, lifted a suffocating weight that they hadn't realized the full extent of until it was gone. For over a decade, every unanswered question had been a barbed wire coil tightening around their hearts. And now, though the wound remained, the coils were severed. No longer haunted by phantom possibilities or cruel speculations whispered behind cupped hands, the void left by her absence could finally be acknowledged for what it was, a space carved out by brutal finality, not mysterious disappearance. They could visit a quiet headstone now, granite cool beneath their fingertips, place fresh flowers, speak words into the rustling wind without the gnawing doubt that perhaps she was still out there, somewhere, lost or hiding, waiting. The tears that fell now were hot and real, the tears of grief unbound, not the frozen tears of agonizing limbo. The process was slow, marked by quiet moments of remembrance around the kitchen table, shared stories that brought both sharp pangs and gentle laughter, and the simple, vital act of being present for each other, leaning shoulder to shoulder against the weight of what they knew. Resilience wasn't a dramatic declaration of strength, but a quiet, persistent turning towards the light filtering through the window each morning. They learned to carry the scar, not as a gaping wound, but as a testament to a love that endured even the darkest betrayal, and a spirit that refused to be broken. The ache remained, a dull throb beneath the surface during quiet evenings, but alongside it grew a quiet strength, forged in the crucible of their long, agonizing wait for justice. Seeing the system, slow and imperfect as it was, finally hold someone accountable, brought a sense of validation that settled deep in their bones, a quiet echo of vindication. It didn't bring her back. Nothing ever could mend that tear in the fabric of their lives, but it affirmed that her life and its violent end mattered deeply. It allowed them to look forward, not forgetting the past, but no longer tethered solely to its cruel uncertainty. Hope wasn't a naive expectation of perfect happiness returning, but the quiet certainty found in shared glances and hesitant smiles. The understanding that even after such profound tragedy, life, however altered, continued, and healing, however gradual, was possible. A quiet path opening before them. Standing by the window, the main character watched the evening sun paint the sky in hues of soft orange and fading violet. A familiar sadness twinged in their chest, a low, persistent ache that the years had softened but never truly erased. It wasn't the raw, tearing grief of the early days, nor the desperate frustration of the long wait for answers, but something quieter, a melancholic hum beneath the surface of everyday life. There was a weariness that settled deep in their bones, a sense of having traversed a vast, difficult emotional landscape, the terrain scarred by the long, arduous journey towards truth. Yet, alongside the sadness sat a quiet gratitude for the truth finally revealed, a faint echo of peace that allowed the memories, both joyful and painful, to exist without the suffocating shadow of the unknown. The future stretched out before them, not a brightly lit boulevard promising easy happiness, but a path winding into the fading light, sometimes obscured by lingering shadows, sometimes illuminated by unexpected moments of quiet grace. It was a path they would walk, one step at a time, carrying their loss not as a crushing burden that defined them, but as a profound, indelible part of who they had become. Looking out at the twilight, softening the hard edges of the world, they felt a quiet certainty that even in the face of irreversible loss and the long shadow of past injustice, the human heart possessed an enduring capacity for both deep sorrow and a quiet, persistent form of hope. The door ahead wasn't fully bright, nor did it promise oblivion to the past, but it was undeniably open, inviting them gently forward into the quiet possibility of tomorrow.